Take your Bibles to the book of Revelation tonight. Revelation chapter number 2. As we continue in our study. I'm sorry, Revelation. Wait a minute, am I right in that one? Let me check something. All right, I have it written down as Revelation 1, and I was about to get really panicked here that I brought the wrong message tonight. Revelation chapter 2, starting in verse number 8. As we look at the second of the 7 churches that were mentioned that John was asked to write to the church, to these churches. So, Revelation chapter 2, beginning in verse number 8, it says, "Unto the angel of the church of Smyrna write, These things saying the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works in tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And in the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogues of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Both the devil shall cast some of you into prison. But ye may be, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. And the angel of the Lord, and into the angel of the church of Pergamos." I went 1 verse 2 first. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we pray that as we look at these scriptures tonight, that they would be a huge encouragement. Father, inevitably, everybody here at some point has found themselves in a time of trial, a time of struggle, a time where honestly, Lord, as if we're to be honest with ourselves, we struggle making heads or tails of what's going on. And Lord, tonight, as we look at a church, Father, the only church of which you bragged on and said one negative thing about, how to help us to learn from this, help us to grow from this. What is it can we learn from your word tonight that'll help us not only in preparation to understand the prophecy, but Father, for us to be effective in this day and age. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So how many of you have ever been in a situation where you bumped up to somebody and you did not speak their language? I don't mean like men and women, all right? There's 2 languages there. All of us have that battle. I don't know, when we moved here, that was the big thing, walking in and hearing people speak different languages, and it's somewhat normal. The hardest time for us, it was the very first missions trip. We took a bunch of teens to Peru, South America. You know, I've been around people who spoke Spanish before. I've been to Puerto Rico. We've taken the classes here. I think I've been 13 times. And so I'm getting kind of used to that. But I'll tell you, shortly after we were there for the first, 8 days, we always had translators. You always knew what was going on. Let me give you one example of something I found silly. They told us we had a soccer game at 2 o'clock. So our group gets ready. We go out to the concrete slab we're playing on, and we're there at 1:55. 2 o'clock comes, 2:10, 2:30, 2:45, 2:50, and I thought I had gotten the time wrong. 3 o'clock, the missionary shows up, and I'm like, "Brother Templeton, I'm sorry, I think I got the time wrong." He goes, "No, you're perfectly right. We said 2 o'clock. It's like, "But it's 3. He said, "Welcome to Latin America, my friend." I was like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "I'm serious. At least 1 hour after the announced time, they show up." He goes, "You just got to get used to it." I said, "What'd you do at 2 o'clock?" He goes, "I took my siesta. I took a nap." I'm on the soccer field, and he's taking a nap. Learn the culture before you go somewhere. But shortly after, maybe you know, there was a young lady in the hospital, and so we were there for a period of time after this. Well, at this point, the missionaries went back to living Peruvian lives, which means we didn't hear a lot of English. And so they took us to a bullfight, which was cool. It was unique. A lot of cultural things we have to see. But I'll never forget, we get into a place where we're buying things. You understand, you walk into these town squares, there's no prices anywhere. And when you walk up and say, "How much is this?" they're going to tell you about 100 times more than it's worth. I'm not kidding. So we walked in, and I'm looking at a pair of dress shoes, and my wife looks over, and she does well with Spanish. I have a hard time finding the bathroom in Spanish, to be honest with you. So she starts talking to them. "How much are the shoes?" They go, $100. And I'm looking down there, I'm like, I wouldn't pay $100 in America for this. And I'm thinking, okay. And so they cut the price back. We ended up paying, I think, $7 for the shoes, by the way. But it was crazy to hear the languages. Well, one of the things, I think some of you heard the story, and I can joke, by the way, I can joke about this since it's now his 20th birthday today, so I don't usually pick on my kids that much. My oldest son, at that time was, I want to say, wasn't 9 months old or something, like 10 months old, and he's sitting and maybe younger than that, but he's sitting in the baby cart as we're pushing him around. I'm trying on shoes, being a really good dad, not paying a bit of attention to my son. My wife is talking them down to a reasonable price, and all of a sudden I turn around to the stroller and he's gone. My first thought was, he's learned to walk fast, man. He's a go-getter. And then I look out of the store and there's Peruvian women handing him around. And I'm like, we're in trouble. And all of a sudden, I realized when it became real, because I heard my wife, "Ah!" as she runs out. They've stolen her baby in Trujillo. We're never getting it back. We're thinking about all on the news and everything. And we're out there trying to explain to them how this is our baby. And so the son, Jonathan Templeton, was with us. He was on the other side of this area, and he hears the ruckus. And he told us later, I heard the ruckus, it had to include the Americans with me. It just had to. So he makes his way back to the middle of this, and he sees my wife trying to pull our son from the claws of these kidnappers. And as one would try, another lady would shove my wife back and grab the baby. And another one, there's like 5 of them, they're passing the baby around. And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to fight these women for this baby. I'm picturing, how's this going to look in the news? Fox News is going to have the white American beating up women for his baby. This is what's going through my mind. And Jonathan walks over and he grabs us, it's okay. And I'm like, no, it's not, they have my baby. He goes, that's normal. I said, kidnapping's normal in South America? He goes, no. It's normal for them to pick a baby up. It means they think it's a very beautiful baby and they just pass it around. And I'm like, that doesn't happen. So he talked to them and he explained the culture. He told them what these weird white Americans were having. You know what these people did in such grace? The lady started laughing at us, thinking we were nuts. You took my baby, but I'm nuts, all right? We find different parts of language that often in today's, you find are difficult. Culture. Can I tell you something that I think is true? If there's one universal language across any country, no matter where you're from, that's suffering. Trials. You don't have to know their language to recognize when someone's struggling. You don't have to speak their language when you can recognize two that are in the same place and they're struggling. There's so many things that separate us as customs and cultures and food, but all the people in the world understand the language of suffering. Now it's interesting in the church we just read about, to know that this was the only one that Jesus had not one negative thing to say concerning the church. Not one. Everyone has some positive, well, some have nothing but negative, but all of them have something where God says, man, I really want you to work on this, except the church of Smyrna. He only commended them for their perseverance. So I asked this question. This is a question I wrote down as I was reading this and evaluating this as the primary thought today. Is suffering really worth it? I mean, suffering for Jesus, is it really worth it? After I'd written this yesterday, I was flipping through, a friend of mine on Facebook posted something. He said that many of you are familiar with the name Lee Robertson. A great man before he passed away, served in church, had a college, really just used of God greatly in his time. And someone asked him, Dr. Robertson, if you could give me just in a short term something, when you think about it, he goes, I understand you don't think yourself a great man, but if you could say what made you who you were, what made you helpful, what made you be more of a godly man, if you could just tell me in a very short amount, what made you who you are today, would you? And Lee Robertson, without blinking, looked right at him and he said, trials. And that was it. It was through suffering that God has brought me to where I am. And we're going to look tonight at that truth, where we can see some things that we've learned about suffering. Number one, let's look at the messenger. Let's look at the messenger that we have here. And the messenger we find in verse 8, and it says, unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. It's interesting, some descriptions here, and there's actually a lot more. A lot of times you look at certain passages, and they're just kind of just descriptions, flowery language, and we sometimes think that's all it is. This one is definitely not simply flowery language. Jesus describes himself, and there's a couple interesting things. Let's look at the power of his description. Christ introduced himself in a manner that highlights his majesty. Jesus had called himself the first and the last. At the very beginning of John's vision. The name he calls, the title used exclusively of God for Israel in Isaiah 44. The implication is this: as the first and the last, Christ claimed to be the Lord of hosts, the creator of heaven and earth, equal in power and majesty to God the Father himself, echoing almost exactly the same description found in Revelation 1:17. He describes himself as the one who was dead and is to life. Now you sit back and say, well, we know, and then you still call that flowery. Can I tell you why I don't believe this is just flowery language and why this is very important for us to understand? We look at this, and in the next few verses, we see the suffering that this church is going through. But as he's writing to this church, they were aware of the suffering. So you have to understand, here's how this works. John writes the letter, it's penned, and then it's mailed to somebody. How he got it there, I actually don't know. And it was given to one of them, and it was transposed, basically. And then it was ultimately given to the pastor, the angel, the messenger in this church. He would then come out and say, we have a message from God, and literally written from God to John, to me, to give to you. And so they come and they're excited. He pulls it out. They're going through suffering. They're looking for an answer. And the first thing that happens is he just says, look who's giving this. Who is it? You know what? They're suffering. They're suffering for the cause of Christ. And so obviously, to be reminded of the majesty of God is an important thing. Number two, he describes himself as one who's dead and is alive. He knows what it's like after. He knows what it's like to suffer. He said, listen, I've been through this. I understand what we're going through. And his descriptions made him so personal to the issue at hand. You're not alone in this. I understand this. I understand all the things going on. And I'm going to walk you. I'm going to help you. We see his majesty in this letter. It's important for the church who is suffering for this Jesus. A great reminder of the greatness of Jesus and his kingdom for the reasons of suffering. I understand suffering is part of life, unfortunately. But suffering for Jesus is a great opportunity. Now you say, wait a minute, that's not a great selling point. Right? Suffering, unfortunately, is part of life. And if there's nothing the last year has taught us, is that we understand that. There's a lot of people suffering in the economy, a lot of people in different battles. Suffering's part of life. And frankly, as American Christians, we're almost asked minimal suffering, to be honest with you. I talk to friends of mine who grew up in the Soviet Union here in this church, and they talk about what it was like to suffer, watching parents go to jail just for the point of having church. People in our congregation recognize, saying, I remember, I'll never forget Peter Linnick telling me that he and their brothers were trained to sit outside the house and look out for the KGB so they could tell their dad whether or not they could have church that day. They would go for the baptisms, if I remember the story correctly. They're getting ready to baptize. They would look out. So if the KGB come, they'd go from a baptism to a picnic or something like that. So they wouldn't get caught because they didn't want to get fined. They didn't want to go to jail. This is normal. We in America, the greatest suffering generally is trying to stay awake during the preacher's preaching. Generally, right? We really don't suffer. But this church suffered greatly. But here's what the Apostle Paul said, who did suffer. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, he said, that I may know him, that I may know God, and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. He said, it was those battles that bring me closer to my God. Can I tell you, we say suffering doesn't seem like a selling point. Can you imagine how many, just picture this. You imagine what it would have been like to go through the last year without having God by your side? The hopelessness. I look at this, and to me, most people say, what's the biggest battle of not having Jesus? Not having the hope and promise that comes with Jesus. Not having the hope that all of this is temporary, and that there is an end, and that this isn't just all there is. Personally, as much as I love life, as much as I enjoy everything there is, aren't you glad this is not it? Work hard. Mrs. Williams working in the post office. She is really glad this is not it. Poor lady. Man, she's probably going to be number one right now. I don't know how she's doing it. But many of us, I just think about it. With everything going on, and as good as some of the great things are, I'm just so glad this is not all that God has given to us. Let's look at number two. There is the personal nature of his message. He talks about the unity of Christ's deity. He says, I am just as God. Unity of Christ's deity and humanity. They're summed up in the brief title as the first. God the Son existed before there was this church, any of these churches, the Roman Empire. And the last, he said, I'm the first and the last. He was there before the churches. He will be there before Joe Biden and Donald Trump and all these people are gone. He was there before the earth was created. And when all of this is gone, he will still be there. And he summed up the importance of this nature by saying, listen, yes, I'm powerful, but it's more than just a divine deity in heaven. I am your God. I like what one man said. Christ will outlive modern day Izmir, Turkey, Europe, which is where these places are, or the entire world system. Christ is the eternal, transcendent one whose plan and work reach beyond the extremes of eternity past and future. At the same time, catch this, Christ is fully human. He has to be human in order to have truly died and rose again. If he wasn't human, there's no way that God could have died on the cross. So his humanity was necessary. Why is it so important to see Jesus both as God and man? Here's a simple thought. If he were only God, he would never have been able to die. Therefore, sinful humanity would still be paying for their own sin. If he were only man, the death he died would not have been enough to pay the price for sin. If he were only God, he might remain so aloof and separated from our suffering, being unable to relate with the battles of life. But if he were only man, his death would have been just another martyrdom of a good man and nothing more. One commentator said it this way: he would have been a weak victim of human tragedy, unable to conquer death, powerless to triumph over the grave. But praise be to God that Christ is both the first and the last, the one who was dead and is come. He is God and he is man. So he's God enough to be able to free us from our sin, man enough to understand the battles that we go through. What did he say? He's the high priest, not like others, but he understands the feeling of our infirmities, yet in all point tempted like as we are, yet without sin. He understands what it meant to go through pain, to go through trials. This message takes in a very unique form. So let's look at number 2, the message. Let's go down to verse number 9. He says, I know thy works in tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogues of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried. And ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death. I want you to go with me somewhere. Imagine yourself sitting in a gathering. Picture these people. Some in our room actually could do this just by memory. Imagine sitting in a gathering in a room, in a place where you hope people don't see you. Remember, it was really, in Smyrna, as well as it was a wealthy place and a great trade place, there were so many other religions, you were persecuted. If you were a Christian, you could not buy, you could not sell, you could not do business. They were financially broken. The Jewish church had turned on them, and so they didn't have anything. Religion hated them, government hated them, and so they were just, and then going to church was even worse, basically illegal. So as they come, they get this place where they can be quiet, and they have the lights dim, and just enough. So they're sitting there, and the gathering of God's people in Smyrna in a cold morning before the sunrise, hoping not to be seen. A small lamp lit the houses of the remaining beaten and beleaguered church members. The once lively crowd full of Christians now features obvious gaps where men and women once sat. Some just fell away due to persecution. Others are simply gone, arrested, exiled, and some of them even executed for their belief in Jesus. Some of you have risked your lives, the preacher says, just to meet this morning, to pray, to sing to God, and to read from the Holy Scriptures. All of you are outcasts, desperate for a word of encouragement from the messenger sitting in your midst. The dim light, your pastor unrolls the scroll and begins to read with a calm, quiet voice, literally a message straight from God. Whispering and shuffling in the room ceases when you hear who sent the message. The risen Lord himself. The entire group seems to hold its breath when Christ begins his commendation. I know your tribulation. I know your poverty. But you are rich, because the richness was in him, not in the world. You imagine that? You've heard preaching, you've heard some of the same things, and all of a sudden a brand new message. And God himself says to the church, I know what you're going through. I recognize it. They're going through it because of him. And so God, in inspiration, goes to this man, sends a letter literally fresh from God. Number one, he understood their suffering. He understood their suffering from personal experience. The knowledge of what was happening at this moment. Jesus went to the cross for those in this room. They knew that. Many of them had probably been there. They'd seen it. They'd seen the gruesome punishment that Jesus had faced to be able to give them this salvation. And so in their minds, what less can I do? This is the true Jesus, and no public person, no politician or anybody's going to stop us from worshiping. By the way you read this is not the only story like it in church history. If you read church history, thousands, tens of thousands of Christians across the globe go to church, some of them today just like this. We don't understand that in America, do we? I'll tell you, we had a small bit of suffering this morning. We really did. The heat really did not work well in the nursery. We had to add 2 more heaters to it. I'm not kidding. Last week, massive persecution. The internet didn't work. I'm being sarcastic, but you understand where I'm coming from? We really do see those as the hardest parts of life. You know, Pastor, I don't know if I can go to church. So-and-so looked at me weird. They didn't do this. You didn't talk about. Oh, we can find reasons not to want to be at church and not to want to worship, can't we? It's pretty easy. I'm telling you, each and every one of us can come up with a million of them. Some of you are thinking, Pastor, we got 45 minutes before the next football game. Get done quick, right? It's easy for us to find a million reasons not to go. The government makes it harder. It's not essential. Personally, I think sometimes in America, we made it easy for the government. We didn't make it essential before the word essential was something we said. Christians throughout generations have sacrificed greatly to give us what we have because of their love for Jesus. He understood this. But you know, there's the specifics of their suffering. This mixture of Roman and Jewish religions created a thorny environment for dedicated Christians. The Romans persecuted believers because they refused to worship the emperor Domitian. The Jewish synagogues rejected them for worshiping Jesus, and they didn't believe in that. Jews in the Roman Empire were legally excused from sacrificing to the emperor, but Christians enjoyed no such exemption, and they were cast out of the synagogue. Believers in this city faced physical, emotional, economic pressure from both Jews and Gentiles. Let's look at number 3. He gives a warning. Verse number 10, he gives a warning. He says, "Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee the crown of life." He gives a warning. I wonder if while these Christians realized that this letter was from Jesus, maybe he stated and recognized their suffering. You know what? This is what I'd be thinking. Jesus has stated this. So you know what? It's over. He's going to solve the problem. It's payback time. He's going to punish the people persecuting us. They're waiting for the letter for Jesus to say, I'm putting an end to all of this, and all of it's going to be over, and there's going to be peace. And as the messenger, the pastor reads, what's he say? Hold on. It's getting worse. Can you imagine that? Hey, I'm waiting for Jesus to say it's over. We're going to throw it off. I'm coming back. It's over. No. Some of you are going to go to jail. Some of you are going to die. I'll tell you what, I'm not sure we'd want to go to church in that setting. And yet they stayed there. He gave a couple things. He says, number 1, we see the person of the struggles. He said the problems will come from Satan. He said he's going to put you in prisons. The extent of the struggle. Some of you are prisoned. Some of you will die. You know what's interesting? He says, hold strong for 10 days. You interesting that he puts in 10 days? Why? Just like Job, Satan has limited power over Christians. Frankly, he only has the power that God will give him. He said, I will allow 10 days of this and then it's over. So it's not permanent. Even when our battles come, we can know that God is in control, and whatever he brings our way or allows our way and all the different pressures, they're temporary. This is the hope we find. That God says in the midst of this, he will be there. He will never leave me. He will hold me through. He will strengthen me. And it's temporary. But then there's promises in the struggle. It's interesting at the end. He says, for those who went through this, he will give a crown of life. And we don't think much about it. Unless you watch the older TV shows from the royalty and the crowns, most of us don't think much about that. The closest thing we have to crowning someone today is inauguration. Really it is. But that one day we're going to stand before God, and jewels and all these things were very valuable. We're going to have an opportunity to receive the rewards for what we've done. And one of them is from suffering. It's called the crown of life. Here's really the simple way to put this. If God allows you or me to go through sufferings, he says, listen, if you endure, if you remain faithful, and you don't quit, when you get to me, I'm going to give you a crown of life. I'm going to reward you for that. Personally, this is easy to say, but I'd rather that over an easier life. Now don't get me wrong. My human nature wants an easy life, don't we all? Don't we all want it easy? We see God this way. God, I'm saved, so if I'm low on money, put it in my mailbox so I can pay. Just throw it in my checking account, that's fine. We like see God as one who solves the problems. And here he says, listen, I know your battle and I understand it's only going to get worse. But trust me, I see it. I'm watching. If there's nothing else that's encouraging, it's the fact that in the midst of these battles, God is not aloof and unaware. He knows what your family's going through. He knows the hurt. And He cries with you over the hurt. Too many times we have God as this distant God who doesn't care and doesn't know and just doesn't really think anything about it. And He reminds this church, I know. I've been there and I love you. That is the God of this church. Let's look at number 4. We see there's a reminder. Let's go down to verse number 11. If I can find it, he says, He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. I got to tell you, this phrase, he that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death, there is so much here. And most people look at this and say, none of it makes sense. So here's what we talk about. There are 2 deaths that every human could face. The first one is physical death. The Bible says it is appointed unto man once to die. Every one of us at some point will die. When that appointment is, we don't know. God knows. But it's just a fact. Outside of Jesus coming back for His church prior to this, all of us are going to die at some point. It's the same thing with taxes. It's just part of life. Many of you have experienced that in your families this year. It's a miserable part of life. But he talks about a second death. Well, what's the second death? You know, the Bible says the wages, the punishment of sin is death. You know what that death is? It's not physical. He said, I'm not going to kill you because of it. There is a second death is known as hell. It's the punishment after the first death. Here's what he says. Listen, for all of you who are going to go through punishment, please remember, when you die, there is no punishment, the second death. You're going to skip that. You're going to enjoy a life of luxury in heaven. But you know what happens to all the people persecuting the church? Eternal punishment. Here's what Jesus says. Please remember, from my perspective, what you see in the world, in the natural world, that's not all there is. There is something coming after. Don't get so wrapped up in what's going on right now that we miss what's going on. What's the premise? There's a section that Apostle Paul tells Timothy when he's encouraging him as a preacher. And he tells him, he says, Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. That sounds great, doesn't it? How do you endure hardness? The next verse, No man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may prove him that has chosen him to be a good soldier. Here's what he says. If I'm going to serve God, I'm going to be more committed with the things of God than I am achieving the things of the world. Please understand, I think we have to make money, we have to take care of our house, we got to live. He's never asking us to give that up. But he's saying, if my focus is on the things of the world, then when the battles of life come, I'm going to struggle with it. Because if I am engulfed in getting what from the world, and God says, I may not give that to you, then I have a hard time with it. He says, I may not give it to you. That's okay. Endure hardness. It's okay. Keep moving forward. Keep suffering. Keep going forward. Be faithful. When this temporary life is over, true life, eternity begins. And I know sometimes I sit back and say, can we really believe this? The Bible claims it. We know it to be true. And that's what we hold on to, is that promise. Religion's got a million different points of view on how to get there. But the key is to come back and remember that Jesus is the answer to this. Not religion, not church, not being good, not being better than somebody. It is simply and totally Jesus. But yes, unfortunately, there may be some, again, more than likely, most of us in this room will never experience what Smyrna is talking about. Most of us won't. There's people across our globe that are today, but most of us won't. America still has kind of written into its Constitution, when I say kind of, it just depends on who interprets it, but written into the Constitution, freedom for Christians. So right now we can enjoy that. But there are people across the globe, just to meet today, had to hide. There are people who are being persecuted by other religions. You know what happens? They sit there, enjoy. He says, crazy. When you have such a love for God and a recognition of all that God's done for you, maybe enduring some suffering for Him, it's not necessarily a bad thing. As a matter of fact, it's considered an honor. I think of those. One of the things that I love, the equation is so phenomenal because often the Christian life, at least the way Jesus describes it, equates to the military life. Every once in a while, I'll go up against someone who's, I see someone in a store, someone who's got a military hat on or something, and I'll walk over and I'll thank them for their service. And I remember one time I did this. Lomeone was rolling in a wheelchair and they had a hat on. I can't remember exactly what conflict they were in. And I walked over and I said, I just want to thank you for your service. And that person looked right up at me. And he said, even though that service put me in this chair, I would do it over again because I love my country. And we see that as an honor, don't we? That's awesome. That's no different than what Jesus is describing here tonight. I love my country, but I love my Lord more. And yes, would I suffer for my country? Yes. I also would suffer for my Lord. And I think some of us get so afraid of, what about this and what about that? Don't worry about it. We're not, the biggest suffering. I do say in some parts of our country this last year, churches were kind of placed in a different realm than the rest of the world when it came to restrictions and things. There was one church, I don't remember exactly the name of the church, throughout last year was fined over $1 million for a meeting. And yet paid it all, which to me is absolutely amazing. Other churches mentioning how many fines they had. Our own friends over at South Rock Baptist Church fined, I want to say tens if not $100,000 when it was all said and done. Just for meeting in church. Bars are open, but the churches, there's a problem. You say that's wrong? At some point, yes. At some point, we need to stand and say we're just going to stand strong. But that's still minimal in comparison to what this church went through. I don't know what it is that you're going through, what it is that God's allowed into your life. Let me just give you a couple reminders as we finish. Number one, remember in Psalm 23, he says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. He said, I can't promise your life will be without battles, but I can promise that I will walk with you through the entire thing. He said in Hebrews chapter 13, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. My greatest prayer when people go through battles is that God would make himself so real to them in the midst of those times. And as I mentioned what Dr. Lee Robertson said at the beginning, one of the things that will draw us to maturity and closer to God is trials. Well, let me put it this way. Here's what one of the things going to happen. Struggles are going to do one of two things in your Christian journey. They're going to mature you, make you closer to God, and make you more passionate for God. Or they're going to run you away from church. And you'll want nothing to do with it. You just say, I'm done. I'm gone. Either one. One situation, some people in the same scenario. One of them, they leave church and I'm done with this and they'll find something. The other person grows in God in such a powerful way. Let me encourage you. Let whatever it is that God has brought you through in 2020 and still happening this year, let it be something that drives you to him, not away. Let it mature you. What did James say? Count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, the trying of your faith worketh patience. If we let him do it, he'll develop something special in our lives. Father, we love you. We thank you for the